This is Greenland, a vast expanse where the silence of the ice has seemed to endure since the dawn of time. An autonomous territory under the Danish crown, it was once the ultimate symbol of absolute peace, where eternal glaciers guarded the secrets of the high north. However, as the world crossed into the early days of 2026, that silence was shattered. Greenland suddenly became the epicenter of an unprecedented shadow war, a geopolitical gambit where the stakes involved nothing less than the total reconfiguration of the global order. Against a backdrop of heightening European alarm over the aggressive expansion of Russian and Chinese influence in the Arctic, a shocking declaration echoed from Washington. President Donald Trump affirmed that the United States would annex Greenland by any means necessary, framing the move as a non-negotiable imperative for national security. This situation presents international observers with a chilling question. What would actually happen if the world's lone superpower decided to seize Greenland through sheer military force? To answer this, we must first look beyond the ice and analyze the actual defensive posture of this island under Danish administration. On a map, Greenland is a titan, spanning over 2 million square kilometers, 6 times the size of Vietnam. But these numbers only scratch the surface. The territory is a natural fortress, guarded by jagged mountain ranges and deep, icy fjords that create a topographical nightmare for any invading force. The climate here is perhaps the most formidable adversary any expeditionary army could face. It is a cold that bites to the bone. Even during the peak of summer, temperatures rarely climb above 10 degrees C. Snow and ice blanket the landscape, turning every logistical movement into a grueling test of endurance. Theoretically, Greenland's natural defensive advantages far exceed those of global flashpoints like Israel or Taiwan. The island is no longer just a barren wasteland. It sits at a vital strategic crossroads, linking the Arctic directly to the vast Atlantic Ocean. Previously, these routes were choked by thick, multi-year ice, but the accelerating pace of climate change in recent decades has led to a rapid melt, unveiling new maritime corridors of immense potential. This transformation not only facilitates shipping, but also opens the door for the supply of goods from Europe to the island, positioning it as a strategic hub between continents. Furthermore, we cannot ignore the gargantuan treasure trove of resources hidden beneath the frost. Below the ice sheets lie vast reserves of oil and gas, alongside rare earth elements and critical minerals that serve as the lifeblood of the global high-tech industry. Denmark, if possessed of sufficient capital and political will, could transform this island into a modern industrial and logistical bastion, interconnected by a resilient network of roads and railways to create an impenetrable Arctic outpost. If a true conflict were to erupt, Denmark's optimal defensive strategy would be to mirror the historic models of Sweden or Finland, holding out for as long as possible, leveraging the brutal terrain and weather to force an adversary into an endless war of attrition. Even against an overwhelming force, Copenhagen theoretically possesses the capability to make an enemy pay an exorbitant price in both blood and treasure. However, this remains a scenario largely confined to theory. The grim reality is that Denmark has never made a sustained effort to build a comprehensive military infrastructure, industrial base, or logistical web on this land. As of today, Greenland remains defined by its raw desolation. Small, isolated settlements cling to the coastlines, severed from one another by walls of ice and fractured geography. This isolation means the capacity for a people's war, or long-term resistance, is nearly non-existent, even if Denmark attempted to surge a large number of troops to the island. A weak logistical backbone ensures that any defending force would likely exhaust supplies and ammunition within mere weeks of sustained engagement. Even more alarming is the sheer fragility of the Danish and European military presence currently stationed in Greenland. In a characteristically blunt critique, President Trump once described the island's defense system as consisting of 2 dog sleds. While the reality is slightly more robust, the disparity remains too vast to function as a credible deterrent. Specifically, Denmark maintains 6 dog sled teams, triple the number Trump cited, but each team consists only of 14 dogs and a handful of specialized personnel. Accompanying these teams are approximately 150 Danish military personnel, scattered across a massive landmass. Recently, under the pressure of the 2026 crisis, France and Germany made a symbolic gesture by contributing 15 elite soldiers each. Yet the most ironic element of this military landscape is that the strongest force currently on the ground is the 200 U.S. personnel attached to technical and space units. With such a tragically meager defensive capacity, the task of protecting the island against a full-scale assault by a major power is functionally impossible. Any Danish defense plan would likely disintegrate within the opening hours of a coordinated U.S. lightning campaign. For Washington, the primary concern is not how to defeat the Danish military, but how to take over Greenland so swiftly that it prevents a massive, unmanageable diplomatic backlash from European NATO allies. To achieve this, U.S. military planners have likely devised a sophisticated invasion roadmap. The highest priority is the immediate seizure of military and security command centers to paralyze the island's communications and its ability to coordinate with the outside world. Next, American forces must rapidly secure critical infrastructure, including civilian airports, deepwater ports, power grids, and satellite telecommunications. Finally, a spearhead would advance directly on the Danish Arctic Command to strip them of legal authority. The nature of this mission demands that U.S. forces appear with lightning speed and overwhelming presence, yet with a strict mandate to minimize bloodshed or damage to the very infrastructure they wish to inherit. The U.S. needs Greenland intact to serve its strategic and economic interests, not as a frozen ruin. In this scenario, the existing U.S. space units on the island would act as vital internal assets, providing precision coordinates and early warning for the incoming reinforcements from the mainland. It would be a war not of annihilation, but of total neutralization, designed to force a surrender before the world even realizes the ice has shifted. To execute such a delicate yet high-stakes operation, the United States would rely on a sophisticated blend of specialized units and overwhelming technological superiority. This is not a task for a traditional heavy army, but rather for the surgical precision of elite operators. Military analysts expect that the core of the invasion force would consist of Delta Force, Navy SEALs, and specialized units from the Marine Corps. These forces are trained for rapid insertion into the most hostile environments on Earth, making the frozen fjords of Greenland their ideal theater. Supporting these ground teams would be an impressive naval task force centered around America-class or San Antonio-class amphibious assault ships. These vessels act as mobile bases, capable of launching both air and sea assaults while remaining largely undetectable in the vast Arctic waters. In the air, a synchronized dance of specialized aircraft would ensure total dominance. C-130 and C-17 Globemaster transport planes would serve as the heavy lifters, ferrying equipment and mobile units, while MH-60 Black Hawk helicopters, modified for extreme cold, would provide the tactical agility needed to leapfrog across the island's scattered settlements. However, the iron fist of this operation would be the air cover. P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft would coordinate with a formidable escort of F-22 Raptors, F-35 Lightning IIs, and F/A-18 Super Hornets. Their mission is twofold. First, to establish total air superiority over Greenland, and second, to serve as a psychological deterrent. Imagine the sight of fifth-generation stealth fighters screaming low over the coastal towns of Nuuk or Sisimiut. The sheer display of power is designed to shatter the will to resist before a single shot is fired. This is a strategy of shock and awe tailored for the 21st century, not to destroy, but to dominate the mental landscape of the defender. If the operation goes according to plan, the primary phase could be completed in as little as 30 minutes. Even if unexpected friction occurs, the Pentagon's timeline would likely demand full control by the end of the first morning. Every minute the conflict drags on is a minute that the international community has to mobilize a response, and for Washington, speed is the ultimate political shield. The hardest task for the special operators on the ground will be the strict no-kill or minimal casualty mandate. The U.S. knows that killing Danish soldiers, citizens of a long-standing ally, would create a diplomatic rift that might never heal. To truly understand the feasibility of this move, we must look at the economic and strategic why that drives Donald Trump's ambition. Greenland is no longer just a wall of ice. It is a gateway to the 21st century economy. As the Arctic ice melts at an unprecedented rate, the legendary Northwest Passage is becoming a viable year-round shipping route. This would slash weeks off the travel time between Europe and Asia, bypassing the volatile Suez Canal and the overcrowded Malacca Strait. Whoever controls Greenland effectively controls the toll booth of the North. Furthermore, the island is estimated to hold 10% of the world's remaining undiscovered oil and gas reserves. But the real prize lies in the rare earth minerals. In an era where the world is desperate to transition to green energy and high-tech weaponry, these minerals are the new gold. Currently, China controls the vast majority of the global supply chain for these elements. By seizing Greenland, the United States would not just be gaining territory. It would be breaking the Chinese monopoly and securing the technological future of the West for the next century. This isn't just a land grab. It's a preemptive strike to secure the survival of the American industrial complex. Before launching such a bold maneuver, a leader as calculated as Donald Trump would undoubtedly study historical precedents and recent geopolitical test cases. Analysts point to the detention of Venezuelan President Maduro earlier in January 2026 as a potential blueprint for how the U.S. might handle high-profile captures and rapid regime shifts. There is also the historical lesson of Denmark itself during World War II. In 1940, Denmark chose to surrender quickly to Nazi Germany to prevent the total destruction of its cities and people. Washington is banking on the idea that, when faced with an existential threat and an unbeatable opponent, the pragmatic Danish government will once again choose survival over a futile, bloody resistance. The opening moves of the campaign would not be kinetic, but diplomatic and psychological. P-8 Poseidon aircraft would fly low-altitude patrols near civilian areas, while Washington's diplomatic machinery would work overtime, asserting that the move is actually a protective measure. They would argue that Europe is too weak to defend the Arctic against Russian or Chinese encroachment, and therefore, the U.S. must step in to protect the Western Hemisphere. By framing the invasion as a necessary act of NATO security, the U.S. aims to paralyze the decision-making process in Brussels and Berlin. While the diplomats talk, the special forces move. The goal is to present the world with a fait accompli, a finished fact. By the time the Danish parliament, the Folketing, can convene for an emergency session, the American flag would already be flying over the Greenlandic parliament in Nuuk. This strategy relies on the deep-seated knowledge that while Europe possesses significant economic power, its military response time and political will are notoriously slow. Washington expects that the European Union will bark loudly in the form of sanctions and fiery speeches. But when it comes to the bite, no one will be willing to go to war with their primary security guarantor over a remote island. The risk is immense, but the potential reward, a permanent American fortress in the north, total control over the new trade routes, and a monopoly on critical minerals, is a siren song that a transactional administration finds impossible to ignore. As the operation shifts from psychological pressure to physical occupation, the sheer logistical might of the United States military begins to manifest in the freezing Arctic air. The initial phase of the actual ground assault would see C-17 and C-130 transport aircraft descending upon the 3,000-meter runway of Pittafik Space Base, already a strategic American stronghold in northern Greenland. These forces would serve a dual purpose, securing the base against any internal sabotage and acting as the northern anvil to the southern hammer. Simultaneously, the second phase would unfold at the island's vital maritime gates. Large amphibious assault ships would release LCAC hovercraft and utility boats, ferrying hundreds of heavily armed Marines directly into the harbors of Sisimiut and Nuuk, the capital and administrative heart of Greenland. Upon seizing the docks, these units would fan out to occupy every strategic town in the vicinity. One specialized contingent would march directly to the Greenlandic Parliament and the self-government buildings, declaring martial law and implementing a total lockdown to prevent any organized civil or political opposition. In the south, the gateway city of Qaqortoq would likely be occupied by a smaller, rapid response unit to ensure the entire coastline is under Washington's thumb. While the coast is being secured, another wave of troops would seize Kangerlussuaq Airport, the island's primary civilian aviation hub. By establishing a total blockade, the United States effectively severs Greenland from the rest of the world. Every vessel attempting to enter or leave the territorial waters would be intercepted by the U.S. Navy, and even the Royal Danish Navy's Arctic patrols would find themselves shadowed, or perhaps forcibly detained, to prevent them from reaching port. The climax of this tactical phase would be the raid on the Danish Arctic Command. Using MH-60 Black Hawk helicopters, Delta Force, or Navy SEALs would execute a fast-rope insertion directly onto the command center. Their mission is to detain the high-ranking Danish officers and secure the communications arrays before a distress signal can be sent to Copenhagen. The only force on the island with the potential for even a symbolic resistance is the serious sled dog patrol. Because these elite scouts are highly mobile and often stationed in remote, unmapped areas, they might evade the initial sweep and transition into a guerrilla warfare stance. A few sporadic shots might echo through the canyons of the East Coast, but the outcome is inevitable. U.S. forces, equipped with thermal imaging and Reaper drones, would eventually track them down. If the serious Rangers refuse to surrender, the tragedy of the conflict would escalate as Washington authorizes the use of attack helicopters to neutralize these final holdouts. The entire kinetic phase of the conflict is designed to be concluded within a strict 10-hour window. This speed is not just a military necessity, but a political one, aimed at preventing a third-party mediator or a rival power from intervening while the situation is still fluid. Once the physical control of the island is solidified, Washington would pivot back to the diplomatic stage to manage the fallout. To preserve some semblance of dignity for the Danish government and Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen, the U.S. would likely issue a formal proposal for a Greenlandic referendum. This is a masterstroke of political theater. Denmark would be presented with a brutal choice: accept the referendum and save face, or refuse and face a total economic and military confrontation they cannot win. For Copenhagen, resistance would mean the immediate collapse of their high-level social welfare system, as the U.S. would likely freeze Danish assets and halt all trade. Faced with the prospect of domestic social unrest and a hopeless war, the Danish government would be forced to capitulate to Washington's demands. With the formal annexation process underway, the story shifts to the normalization of the occupation. To satisfy domestic public opinion in the U.S. and mitigate international outrage, the administration would likely follow the Crimea model of 2014, but with a distinctly American polish. A public referendum would be organized with lightning speed. To avoid the blatant suspicion that follows a 96.7% victory, the U.S. would manipulate the results to a more realistic figure, perhaps 60% or even 50.05%. This creates the illusion of a hard-fought democratic choice, making it much harder for international bodies like the UN to intervene. To ensure the local population's cooperation, Washington would unleash an unprecedented prosperity package. Every Greenlandic citizen could be offered immediate direct payments of up to $100,000, alongside massive federal investments in healthcare, education, and infrastructure. The message is clear: leaving the neglect of the European motherland for the abundance of the American fold is not just a political shift, it is a life-changing financial windfall. As the dust begins to settle on the island, the focus turns to the grieving families of those few Danish soldiers who may have fallen in the initial skirmishes. In a display of calculated magnanimity, Washington would offer massive financial compensation, attempting to bury the scandal of the invasion under a mountain of hush money. In the United States, the mainstream media and Hollywood would begin the long process of reframing the event as a heroic rescue or a necessary liberation, eventually turning the greatest geopolitical heist of the century into a footnote or a cinematic plot point. However, the world beyond America's borders would not be so easily distracted. Prime Minister Frederiksen's warning that such an act would mark the beginning of the end for the Western alliance would start to ring true. The territorial gain of Greenland might satisfy short-term economic and strategic hunger, but it risks poisoning the well of international relations for generations to come. The transactional nature of this conquest sends a chilling message to every American ally: you are only as safe as you are useful. The seizure of Greenland would trigger a geopolitical earthquake, the likes of which haven't been seen since the end of the Cold War. While the United States might celebrate the acquisition of the world's largest island, the institutional framework of Western security, NATO, would likely begin to fracture in real time. This is the mind eclipse of modern diplomacy, where the shadow of a single superpower's ambition darkens the trust built over 8 decades. Prime Minister Frederickson's grim prophecy would manifest as member states realize that the North Atlantic Treaty's core tenet, Article 5, is meaningless if the aggressor is the alliance's own leader. While the military structure might remain on paper, the soul of the organization would be dead. This vacuum of trust would force European nations to look inward and toward one another, sparking the long-debated strategic autonomy of the European Union. No longer content to be under the American security umbrella, countries like France, which has a long history of independent foreign policy dating back to Charles de Gaulle, would likely lead the charge in forming a new, purely European defense coalition. The ripples of this betrayal would extend far beyond the Atlantic. In the Mediterranean, a new axis of power could emerge as Italy, Greece, and Turkey observe the American move with profound suspicion. Turkey, in particular, a nation that has often balanced its NATO membership with its own regional ambitions, might see this as the final signal to pivot away from the West. Under such a scenario, Ankara could establish an informal, non-paper alliance with Russia, positioning itself as the leader of a middle corridor that connects the Islamic world with the Eurasian heartland. This would create a nightmare scenario for Western planners: a fractured Europe, a hostile Turkey, and a Mediterranean Sea that is no longer a NATO lake. By taking Greenland, the United States might inadvertently push its most strategic allies into the arms of its greatest rivals, trading a piece of ice for the stability of the entire Eurasian rim. For Russia and China, the American annexation of Greenland would be a propaganda gift of astronomical proportions. Moscow would exploit the situation to drive a permanent wedge between Washington and its European neighbors, broadcasting a singular message to the world. The United States is an unreliable partner that will stab its friends in the back the moment it covets their land. In the Arctic, Russia would likely respond by further militarizing its northern sea route, justifying the buildup as a defensive necessity against American expansionism. In the shadows of the diplomatic chaos, the Kremlin would accelerate its operations in Eastern Europe, particularly in Ukraine, betting that a distracted and divided West will have neither the will nor the unity to continue its support. The annexation would provide Vladimir Putin with the ultimate moral equivalency, allowing him to frame his own territorial ambitions as no different from those of the White House. China, meanwhile, would play a longer and more subtle game. Beijing would use the Greenland incident to present itself as the responsible global leader and the true champion of international law. They would intensify their efforts to court nations in the global south, pointing to Greenland as proof that the rules-based international order is merely a front for American hegemony. In Asia, the impact would be particularly acute for Japan and South Korea. These nations, which rely heavily on American security guarantees against a rising China and a nuclear North Korea, would be forced to ask themselves a terrifying question. If Washington could abandon a NATO ally like Denmark for a few mineral mines, what would stop them from abandoning Tokyo or Seoul if the cost-benefit analysis shifts? This uncertainty would weaken the first island chain strategy, allowing China to project its power further into the Pacific with less resistance. The most tragic casualty of this new reality would likely be Taiwan. The American action in Greenland would signal a definitive shift toward transactional realism. For a leader like Donald Trump, the defense of a small island 10,000 kilometers away might not hold the same value as a strategic bargain with a rival power. If the United States has shown that it values tangible assets and short-term gains over long-standing commitments, then the survival of Taiwan might be traded away in exchange for trade concessions or a neutral stance on other global issues. Without the absolute certainty of American intervention, the authorities in Taipei might find themselves with no choice but to seek a conditional surrender or unconditional submission to Beijing. The map of the world would not just be redrawn in the north. It would be shattered in the east, as the era of American-led global security gives way to a chaotic, multipolar scramble for survival. Ultimately, the question of whether the United States would actually launch a military campaign to annex Greenland remains one of the most provocative what-if scenarios of the modern era. While the tactical path to victory appears relatively straightforward due to the overwhelming disparity in force, the strategic aftermath resembles a labyrinth of unintended consequences. A leader like Donald Trump, known for his unpredictable maneuvers and a business-first approach to diplomacy, might see the immediate acquisition of vast rare earth deposits and control over the new Arctic shipping lanes as a crowning achievement for the American economy. From his perspective, leaving a messy geopolitical landscape for future generations is a secondary concern compared to securing American industrial dominance in the 21st century. However, the cost of this transactional victory would be the total erosion of the moral high ground that has defined American leadership since the end of the Second World War. As we look toward the horizon of 2026 and beyond, the Arctic is no longer just a remote wilderness. It is the new frontier of global competition. If Washington were to proceed with such a radical plan, it would signal the definitive end of the era of international cooperation and the beginning of a neo-mercantilist age, where might makes right. The world would watch as the historic alliances that provided stability for decades dissolve into a collection of nervous, self-interested regional powers. For Greenland itself, the transition from a neglected Danish territory to a vital American hub would bring unimaginable wealth to its citizens, but at the cost of being a permanent pawn in a high-stakes game between superpowers. The island would be transformed into a hyper-militarized fortress, a northern version of the Cold War's front lines, forever losing its identity as a land of pristine peace. In the final analysis, the pursuit of Greenland by force would be a gamble of cosmic proportions. The United States would gain a continent-sized treasure chest and a permanent vantage point over the North Pole, but it might lose the very thing that made it a superpower, its network of trusted allies and the stability of the global order. Whether the future brings a peaceful purchase, a diplomatic stalemate, or a shocking military intervention, one thing is certain: the fate of Greenland is now inextricably linked to the survival of the Western world. We are entering a time where the maps are being redrawn, and the cold winds of the North are bringing with them a new and uncertain reality. Only time will tell if the world's most powerful nation is willing to burn its bridges in the Atlantic to claim the ice of the Arctic.